Hi there, I'm Pitt, this is the X100VI, and that's the camera I have been using as my daily driver for the past month. And let me tell you something, I have thoughts, many thoughts. And now I would say, let's get into the first impressions review of this camera. Let's talk about the build quality of the X100VI first. And Fujifilm has recently been flamed for reducing the build quality of some of their cameras relative to all the cameras they have produced. And that's something I've noticed too when I, for instance, moved from the X-T2 to the X-T5, that the X-T5 was significantly worse built than the X-T2, which was interesting. Regarding the X100VI, I cannot truly tell you whether the build quality has been reduced because this camera is fully built from metal, so there is nothing moving, there is nothing that feels cheap about it, and it is also weather sealed if you put an additional adapter ring in front of your lens. And I have really used this camera extensively in practice, so I have used it in the very cold, in the rain, in the snow even, and it has withstood it all. Also, given that I used the small adapter ring that I screwed in front of the lens to also fully weather seal the lens. But more on that weather sealing issue a little bit later in the video. But regarding build quality, so far I've had a really good experience with the camera, and it might not be quite, let's say, like a Q3 level of build quality, but so far it really stood up to the task, and I hope that's also going to last for the months to come. Let's talk about the handling of the camera next. And the thing about small cameras is that usually, especially in terms of handling, you need to make compromises. And this is also the case here because this camera doesn't have a very deep grip. And that's the reason why I actually got myself a little thumb grip that I can just attach to the hot shoe of the camera. And it's going to give me an additional point of contact. And I actually think that it's a really, really good alternative to an extra grip that you can attach to the camera because it's just less invasive and it's not going to hurt the form factor of this camera. And I'm going to put this thumb grip that I put on my camera in the description below if you want to check it out. Let's talk about the optical quality of the lens next. And I know there is many people who have wondered whether such a tiny lens can actually stand up to the task of resolving a 40 megapixel sensor. And let me just explain you what type of photographer I am. So I'm a practical photographer, so I don't shoot brick walls or I don't really pixel peep that much into my photos. And the only thing I value is that the lens is wide open, sharp in the middle of the frame and sharp throughout the frame when I stop it down. And regarding this lens, these two criteria are actually fulfilled because this lens is sharp, wide open, and it even becomes slightly sharper when you stop it down to a 5.6 for instance. And that also means that the sensor that they have decided to put into this camera actually makes sense because especially in a camera that just has a fixed wide angle lens, the only real way to change the field of view is to digitally crop in to your photo. And given this lens now has the 40 megapixel sensor and actually also resolves that pixel density, you can crop in further and still retain an acceptable amount of resolution, which is definitely an upgrade to a camera like the X100VI relative to the X100V. So let's talk about my favorite features of this camera next. And there is three that I want to highlight here. The first one is the leaf shutter. And if you've never used an X100 camera, you might be very confused when you take the first photo because the mechanical shutter doesn't really make a sound. Why? Well, because it's a leaf shutter that can be very, very silent while still operating as a mechanical shutter. And initially I assumed that it was just shooting electronic shutter mode, but no, the mechanical shutter is just simply not louder than it is. So let me actually give you an example where this leaf shutter comes in. So recently I took a train trip from Luxembourg to Vienna in Austria, and I came across some beautiful landscapes like mountains, fantastic skies, and beautiful sceneries. And I wanted to capture them, and I just had my X100VI with it. The train was dead silent, there was nothing going on. I also didn't want to bother the person next to me with a loud shutter. So this leaf shutter in this camera was so silent, nobody even noticed that I was taking photos. And now you might wonder, well, couldn't you just shoot an electronic shutter? It's going to be equally as silent. And yes, that's true. But the issue is that if you use electronic shutter, you might encounter issues related to using electronic shutter, most notably rolling shutter. And since we are sitting in a moving train, so the landscape passes by, it could see that you actually see like these wobbly effects if you take the photo, which does not happen if you shoot in mechanical shutter. And the leaf shutter in this camera is both mechanical and silent. So perfect for train rides, for instance. The next thing I really like about this camera, which is arguably the biggest feature of this X100VI over its predecessor, the X100V, is that it finally has in-body image stabilization, or IBIS. And in my opinion, it really truly transforms the way you can use this camera. Well, one basic benefit is that you can finally shoot smooth, handheld, static video, which would look very shaky on an X100V or another unstabilized camera. And the second significant feature, arguably most significant one, is that I can finally drop my shutter speeds to very low shutter speeds and shoot handheld long exposures. And I could, for instance, easily handhold 1/4 of a second and create light trails or shutter drag effects. And you know that your frame will stay nice and steady, which was not the case on the X100V. And this also brings me to the last feature that I'm really excited about in the Fuji X100VI, which is the built-in ND filter. And you might wonder, yes, this feature has already been in the X100V before, so the predecessor. But in my opinion, that neutral density filter didn't really make a whole lot of sense in that camera because its use case was simply very limited. And previously, you could effectively just use the ND filter if you were shooting in relatively bright conditions and you wanted to shoot wide open. Because at some point, your shutter speed has to be so high that the mechanical shutter of your camera is actually not fast enough anymore to block off that amount of light. And usually most cameras then move to the electronic shutter, but there is a few disadvantages when using that electronic shutter. We mentioned it previously, rolling shutter. And the second issue is that you also lose a stop of dynamic range. And in that case, you would just enable the ND filter, which darkens your scene, therefore blocks off a part of the light in your frame. You can still shoot wide open, but your shutter speed is now low enough that you can still shoot on the mechanical shutter. But the real reason why you usually use ND filters is to create longer exposures, even if it's very bright outside. So if you, for instance, want to soften the water of the waterfall, you couldn't really do this on an X100V, even when you had the filter enabled, just simply because you could not handhold your long exposures, given the camera did not have IBIS. But since we now have IBIS in the X100VI, it actually makes sense to use that ND filter and to use longer shutter speeds without having to risk that your shot is going to be blurry because the camera is finally stabilized. And now that we've talked so positively about the camera, let's also get to some more negative aspects of it. And the first two are just simply due to the body design of the camera and the fact that it's a very small camera. And the first negative is that this just has a two-way tilt screen and not a three-way tilt screen, as for instance on the Fuji X-T5 that's filming me right now. So yes, if you shoot in horizontal mode, you can flip the screen of your camera up or you can flip it down. And that's already really good, but I shoot actually vertically quite a lot. And I also tend to shoot from unique angles, so I go very low, I go very high, and the thing is that I cannot vertically flip it out, so the third way to tilt the screen is missing. And this is just due to the camera being very small and the screen should be flushed into the body design, and if you add this additional hinge that the X-T5 has, it would actually make for a bigger camera, so this was a compromise that had to be made, but it's still a negative. And the next negative of the X100VI is again a consequence of the smaller form factor of the camera, which is battery life. If you want to keep the camera small, you will have to make compromises and build in a smaller battery into the camera relative to bigger cameras that can handle bigger batteries. And this is also the case here because the X100VI only takes the older type batteries that has, for instance, been in the X-T3 or the X-T30. And I'm, for instance, a power user, so it happened quite frequently to me that I burned through one of these batteries, and this, for instance, never happened on my X-T5. So having a spare is definitely mandatory if you are a power user. The next negative we should probably touch upon is autofocus. And autofocus is not necessarily the biggest strength of Fujifilm. And I have used many of their latest generation cameras and they all have the same autofocusing flaws. And to just keep it brief, because it's not camera specific, it has problems if there is more people in the frame because it jumps from one face to another and it doesn't really know where to focus. And the second issue is that if your subject is covered up for a very brief moment, the camera might just focus on something else. And that's also a bit weird. Me personally, I shoot my camera in single point autofocus, meaning that where I place my focusing box, the focus will also be. It's much more predictable, and in 99% of the cases, I do not miss the shot. So if you're coming from a Sony platform, a Canon platform, or Nikon platform, you're definitely used to having better autofocus. And the final issue is the weather sealing aspect of things, because this camera is only fully weather sealed if you seal the lens of the camera with an additional filter. And for me, that's puzzling for two reasons. First of all, you need to buy an additional filter for an already relatively expensive camera. And secondly, it also extends the lens by around 1/3 if you just attach the filter, and even more if you also attach the lens hood to it. By the way, the filter and the lens hood I use for this specific camera, I also put them in the description below. The second reason why I think that this non-weather sealed lens is so weird is because Fujifilm has actually released a 27mm f2.8 pancake lens for the interchangeable cameras that is weather sealed, and it appears to be using the same autofocusing motor technology, meaning that it also slightly extends when it focuses, which I suspect to be the reason why this X100VI is not fully weather sealed out of the box. So why does Fujifilm manage to make a 27mm f2.8 pancake lens that is weather sealed despite a very similar construction, while their premium compact camera is not? That's the puzzling part about the weather sealing issue. But in the end, it is possible to fully weather seal the camera. I have taken it in the roughest conditions, and if you place the filter in front of your lens, the camera will be fully weather sealed, which is in my opinion the most important aspect. You know, there is two things that I hate in photography. The first one is to think about gear and what specific lens I should probably use to get the best photo in a specific scenario. Why do I hate it? Well, because it means that I have to dedicate brain cells to this gear related issue instead of actually doing what I love, which is to take photos. And the second thing that I really hate about photography is to just use heavy gear and to carry with me multiple lenses and multiple camera bodies. And the X100VI alleviates these two issues for me. First of all, it has this fixed 23mm lens, so there is no incentive to even think that I might need a different focal length for a specific scene. You just shoot with what you have, which is this wide-angle 23mm lens, and you take the photo and you make the best out of it because you can dedicate all your brain capacities to taking a great photo. And the second thing is that this camera is really compact, since the lens is literally built into the camera body. And in my opinion, given how capable this camera is in such a tiny package, is the main reason why I personally love it so much. What is your opinion on the X100VI, and do you think that the arguments I brought up in favor or against the X100VI make sense? Let me know in the comment section below. And with that being said, thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope to see you in next week's video. Bye.